The Haunting at Blackwood Manor. The story of Blackwood Manor is one that locals in the small town of Hollow Creek, Massachusetts, still whisper about in hushed tones. Built in 1878, the grand Victorian-style house once stood as a testament to the wealth and power of its original owner, Edward Blackwood, a wealthy shipping magnate. However, over the decades, Blackwood Manor fell into decay and gained a sinister reputation. For decades, the house stood empty, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the world. Children dared each other to approach its wrought iron gates, and teenagers told ghost stories about the house during late-night campfires. But few ever dared to step foot inside until the Thompson family arrived. In the fall of 1998, David and Sarah Thompson, along with their two children, Emily and Jacob, decided to move from Boston to Hollow Creek, seeking a quieter life away from the city. When they found Blackwood Manor listed for an unbelievably low price, they couldn't resist. The realtor assured them that the rumors about the house were nothing more than local folklore. "It's an old house," the realtor said with a forced smile. "Every old house has its stories." Despite the warnings from townsfolk, the Thompsons moved in. At first, everything seemed fine. They spent the first few weeks settling in, renovating where they could, and ignoring the creaks and groans of the old house settling. But soon, strange things began to happen. It started with small things: doors that were left open, lights flickering despite new bulbs, and cold spots in random parts of the house. Sarah dismissed these incidents as quirks of an old home. David laughed it off, attributing it to faulty wiring or drafts. But Emily and Jacob weren't so sure. "There's something in my room," Emily said one night at dinner, her eyes wide with fear. "It watches me while I sleep." David chuckled nervously. "You're just getting used to the house, sweetheart. It's probably just shadows." Jacob, however, nodded in agreement with his sister. "I hear footsteps in the hallway at night. They stop right outside my door." A week later, Sarah was folding laundry in the basement when she heard it, a soft whisper, almost like a child's voice, calling her name. She froze, her heart pounding. "David?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. She climbed the stairs, trying to shake off the unease. As she reached the top, she glanced down the hallway and saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end. Motionless, it was tall, with unnaturally long limbs, and its face was obscured by darkness. Sarah blinked, and the figure was gone. The incidents grew more frequent and more aggressive. Doors slammed shut on their own. Objects moved from one room to another without explanation. The family's dog, Max, refused to enter certain parts of the house, barking and growling at seemingly empty corners. One night, David woke to the sound of whispering. He sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to be coming from the hallway. He got out of bed and opened the door, finding the hallway bathed in darkness. "Hello?" he called out. The whispering stopped. Suddenly, a cold gust of air blew past him, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. David stumbled back, his heart racing, determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences. Sarah began researching the history of Blackwood Manor. She spent hours at the local library, digging through old newspapers and town records. What she found chilled her to the bone. The house had a dark history. Edward Blackwood, the original owner, had been accused of unspeakable acts. Several of his servants had vanished without a trace, and there were rumors that he had been involved in occult practices. The townsfolk believed that Edward had cursed the house before his mysterious disappearance in 1889. Sarah also found reports of previous owners who had suffered strange fates, sudden illnesses, unexplained accidents, and, in some cases, insanity. The most recent occupants before the Thompsons had fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving all their belongings behind. Driven by desperation, David and Sarah decided to investigate the basement, which they had largely avoided since moving in. Armed with flashlights, They descended the creaking stairs. The basement was cold and damp, with a lingering smell of mildew. At the far end, they found a hidden door partially concealed behind an old cabinet. It creaked open to reveal a small, windowless room. Inside, they found strange symbols etched into the walls, along with remnants of candles and other ritualistic objects. In the center of the room was an old, dusty trunk. David hesitated before opening it. Inside were faded photographs, a journal, and several odd trinkets. The journal belonged to Edward Blackwood, and its contents were disturbing. A detailed account of rituals and sacrifices he had performed in the house. As David read aloud, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the basement. The lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as the family tried to escape the house. The front door wouldn't budge, as if an unseen force were holding it shut. The windows, too, refused to open. Suddenly, the house seemed alive, its walls pulsating with a malevolent energy. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. Emily screamed as a dark figure lunged at her from the hallway. David grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it wildly, but the figure vanished into thin air. The family huddled together in the living room, too afraid to move. Hours passed, but the night seemed endless. The whispering never stopped, and the shadows continued to circle them like predators waiting to strike. By morning, the house had fallen silent. The front door stood ajar, as if inviting them to leave. Without a word, the Thompsons grabbed what they could and fled, never looking back. To this day, Blackwood Manor remains abandoned. Locals claim they still see lights flickering in the windows at night and hear the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from within. No one knows what truly happened to the Thompsons after they left. Some say they moved far away, while others believe the house never really let them go. The Curse of Hollowridge House. Hollowridge House stood at the edge of Fairview, a small town in West Virginia. The house, built in 1823, had always been a subject of fascination and fear for the locals. Towering on a lonely hilltop, it cast a long shadow over the valley below, its crumbling stone walls and gabled roof like something out of a dark fairy tale. Over the years, Hollowridge had earned a dark reputation, one steeped in tragedy, mystery, and ghostly tales passed from generation to generation. Despite the warnings, in the summer of 2003, the Harper family, Michael, his wife Jennifer, and their 3 children, 16-year-old Olivia, 12-year-old Ethan, and 8-year-old Lily, decided to move in. The house was too large, too cheap, and too perfect to ignore. "It's a fixer-upper," Michael had said with a confident smile, determined to restore the old house to its former glory. Jennifer wasn't so sure, but Michael's enthusiasm had won her over. The kids were excited by the idea of living in what they called a castle. At first, everything seemed almost normal. The family spent the first few days cleaning and unpacking. Olivia claimed the large bedroom at the far end of the second floor, while Ethan and Lily shared a room down the hall. Jennifer admired the antique furniture that had been left behind, grand armoires, faded paintings, and an old upright piano that sat in the parlor. But it didn't take long for the strangeness to begin. It started with the piano. Late at night, Jennifer would hear soft, discordant notes drifting through the house. She would check the parlor, but the room was always empty. The piano lid closed. "It's just an old house settling," Michael said. "Creaks and groans are part of the charm." Jennifer tried to believe him. One afternoon, Ethan discovered a door on the 3rd floor that wouldn't open. It was at the end of a narrow corridor, hidden behind a tapestry. He tugged at the handle, but it refused to budge. "Dad, there's a secret door up here," he called, his voice echoing down the staircase. Michael joined him, inspecting the door. "Probably just stuck," he said, giving it a few firm pushes. But no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't move. "We'll leave it for now," he decided. "I'll deal with it later." That night, Ethan dreamed of the door. In his dream, it opened slowly, revealing a dark room filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. He woke up drenched in sweat. The image of the door burned into his mind. Lily was the first to hear the whispers. She woke up one night to find her room bathed in an eerie blue light. The whispering seemed to come from the walls, soft and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. "Ethan, stop it," she hissed, thinking it was her brother playing a prank. But when she looked over at his bed, he was fast asleep. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. Lily pulled the covers over her head and squeezed her eyes shut until sleep finally took her. The next morning, she told Jennifer what she had heard. "You probably had a bad dream, sweetie," Jennifer said, brushing her daughter's hair. "It's nothing to worry about." But Lily wasn't convinced. Neither was Olivia, who had begun to notice strange shadows moving across her bedroom walls at night. Shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. It wasn't until a month after moving in that things escalated. Michael was working late in the study one night when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Thinking it was one of the kids, he called out, "Olivia? Ethan? Lily?" There was no response. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until they stopped right outside the study door. Michael stood up, his heart pounding. Slowly, he opened the door, expecting to see one of the children. But the hallway was empty. As he turned to go back inside, he felt it, a rush of cold air and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. His breath caught in his throat, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something at the far end of the hallway, a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still. He blinked, and it was gone. Determined to understand what was happening, Jennifer began digging into the history of Hollow Ridge House. She visited the local library and spoke to some of the older residents of Fairview. What she discovered was chilling. Hollow Ridge had once belonged to the Crowley family, a wealthy but reclusive clan known for their strange practices. Rumors of occult rituals and dark ceremonies swirled around them, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. The family's fortune had dwindled, and by the early 1900s, the last Crowley heir had vanished without a trace. There were stories of other families who had lived in the house over the years, families who had suffered bizarre tragedies and unexplained disappearances. Some had fled in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. Jennifer's hands trembled as she read an old newspaper article about the house. The headline read, Hollow Ridge House, Cursed or Haunted. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Michael decided to deal with the locked door on the third floor. Armed with a crowbar, he forced it open. What lay beyond took his breath away. The room was small and windowless, filled with dust and cobwebs. In the center stood an ancient-looking wooden chair surrounded by a circle of strange symbols etched into the floor. The walls were covered in faded, hand-drawn pictures, dark, twisted images of faceless figures and shadowy shapes. And then there was the smell, a rancid, cloying odor that made Michael gag. "What is this place?" Jennifer whispered, standing behind him. "I don't know," Michael replied, his voice barely audible. "But I don't think we should be here." As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. That night, the house came alive. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Shadows moved through the house with purpose, and the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the windows. Olivia woke to find her bed surrounded by dark figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She screamed, and the figures vanished in an instant. Downstairs, Michael and Jennifer tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed shut, as though the house itself refused to let them go. "We had to get out of here," Michael shouted, pounding on the door. Ethan and Lily clung to Jennifer, their eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, The old piano in the parlor began to play on its own, a haunting, discordant melody that echoed through the house. Morning finally came, and with it, an eerie silence. The front door swung open on its own, and the family didn't hesitate. They grabbed what they could and fled, leaving everything else behind. To this day, Hollow Ridge House remains abandoned. Locals claim they still hear the piano playing at night and see strange lights flickering in the windows. Some say the house is waiting for its next occupants, ready to continue its dark legacy. No one has dared to live there since the Harpers. No one ever will. The Haunting of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as one of America's most infamous haunted locations. Situated in Louisville, Kentucky, this massive, Gothic-style building was once a state-of-the-art tuberculosis hospital in the early 20th century. Though it was initially built with good intentions, it eventually became the site of unthinkable suffering and death. Thousands of patients died within its walls, and over time, the hospital became a symbol of death, despair, and something far darker. In 2005, journalist Emily Foster and her team set out to document the history of Waverly Hills for a series on haunted locations across America. The plan was simple: spend 5 nights inside the abandoned hospital, interview locals, and capture footage for a documentary. What they didn't realize was that they were about to experience something far more terrifying than they had ever anticipated. The first day was deceptively calm. Emily and her small crew, David, the cameraman, Jessica, the audio technician, and Tom, the producer, arrived at the imposing structure just before sunset. The building loomed over them, its windows dark and empty like soulless eyes. "Creepy," Jessica muttered, adjusting her headphones. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." Tom chuckled. "Come on, it's just an old building. Nothing we haven't seen before." But Emily wasn't so sure. Something about Waverly Hills felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Even as they unloaded their gear, they set up camp in what had once been the main lobby. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and mildew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature inside the building dropped sharply. "All right, let's get some establishing shots," Emily said, trying to sound confident. "We'll start the interviews tomorrow." David nodded and began filming, his camera whirring softly. The crew moved methodically through the building, capturing footage of the decaying hallways, broken windows, and peeling paint. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. It began with small noises, footsteps echoing down empty corridors, doors creaking open on their own. Jessica's equipment picked up faint whispers that none of them could hear in real time. "There's something here," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it." Emily tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but deep down, she knew Jessica was right. Waverly Hills had a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in the country, and they were starting to see why. Later that night, while reviewing the footage, David froze. "Guys, come look at this." The group gathered around the small monitor. The footage showed an empty hallway, but for a split second, a shadowy figure appeared at the far end. It moved quickly, too quickly to be human, and then vanished into thin air. "What the hell was that?" Tom asked, his face pale. "I don't know," Emily admitted, her heart pounding, "but we need to be careful." The second day was far worse. The crew ventured deeper into the hospital, exploring the infamous 5th floor, home to the so-called Death Tunnel, a sloped underground passageway once used to discreetly transport dead bodies out of the hospital. As they descended into the tunnel, the air grew colder and heavier. Jessica's breath came out in visible puffs, even though it was the middle of summer. "This place gives me the creeps," she said, gripping her audio recorder tightly. Halfway down the tunnel, David stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" The others listened. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness ahead. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer. "We need to get out of here," Jessica said, panic rising in her voice. "No," Emily said, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "We need to see what it is." They pressed on, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps continued, always just out of sight, until they reached the end of the tunnel. There was no one there. "Let's go back," Tom said, his voice trembling. "We've got enough footage." That night, the crew experienced their first physical encounters. Emily woke up to the sound of someone whispering her name. She sat up, scanning the dark room, but saw nothing. "Jessica? David? Tom?" she called, her voice barely audible. No response. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A dark figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and featureless, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure slowly raised an arm and pointed at her. Emily scrambled for her flashlight and shone it toward the doorway. The figure was gone. By morning, all of them had experienced something similar. Tom had felt an icy hand grip his ankle in the middle of the night. Jessica had heard a child's laughter echoing through the hallways. David had seen shadows darting across the walls. "This place is trying to scare us," Emily said over breakfast, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't let it win." Determined to understand what they were dealing with, Emily spent the third day interviewing locals and digging through old records. What she found was horrifying. Waverly Hills had been home to countless tragedies. Patients had been subjected to experimental treatments, many of which were more torture than cure. The death toll was staggering, and there were rumors of dark rituals performed by desperate staff members seeking to cure the incurable. One story, in particular, stood out: a nurse who had hung herself in room 502. Her spirit was said to haunt the hospital, appearing to those who ventured too close to the room. Some said she was still searching for a lost child, while others believed she was a warning to stay away. Emily knew they had to document room 502. Despite the risks, over the next 2 days, the haunting grew more aggressive. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered on and off, and objects moved on their own. The crew began to unravel under the constant pressure. Jessica refused to leave her sleeping bag at night. Tom started talking to himself, insisting that something was following him. David became withdrawn, his eyes hollow and haunted. "We need to leave," Jessica begged. "This place is going to kill us." "We can't," Emily insisted. "We're too close to the truth." But the truth was far darker than any of them could have imagined. On the final night, the crew set up cameras throughout the hospital, determined to capture definitive proof of the paranormal. Emily stayed in room 502, her heart pounding as she waited for something, anything, to happen. At first, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open slowly. The temperature plummeted, and Emily could see her breath in the air. A soft voice whispered in her ear, "Get out." The door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Emily screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. When the crew finally found her, she was curled up in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. "We're leaving," Tom said, pulling her to her feet. Now, the crew never finished their documentary. The footage they captured was too disturbing, too dangerous to release. Each of them left Waverly Hills with scars, both physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. To this day, Emily refuses to speak about what happened in room 502. Locals say she's never been the same. As for Waverly Hills, it remains a dark and silent sentinel, watching over the valley below, and it's still waiting for the next visitors brave, or foolish, enough to enter.
The Curse of Winchester House. Few places in America have a history as mysterious and chilling as the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. Built by Sarah Winchester, the widow of firearm magnate William Wirt Winchester, the mansion is a sprawling maze of rooms, staircases that lead to nowhere, and hidden passageways. Legend has it that Sarah believed she was cursed by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and the only way to escape their vengeance was to build her house continuously, forever. For over 38 years, construction never stopped. Workers labored day and night, adding rooms, sealing off others, and creating a labyrinthine structure designed to confuse and trap malevolent spirits. But despite her efforts, some say the spirits never left. And long after Sarah's death in 1922, the house has remained a hotspot for paranormal activity. In 2012, a team of paranormal investigators, led by Mark Evans, a seasoned ghost hunter, decided to spend an entire week inside the Winchester house. Determined to uncover the truth behind its haunting, what they encountered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Mark and his team arrived at the mansion just before dusk. The sprawling structure stood before them like a sleeping giant, its countless windows glinting in the fading light. "It's even bigger than I imagined," whispered Chloe, the team's medium, as she adjusted her backpack. "And creepier," added Dan, the cameraman. His eyes scanned the house, lingering on the darkened windows. "Feels like it's watching us." Mark chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Relax, guys, it's just a house. A very weird house, but still just a house." But deep down, even he felt the weight of the mansion's dark history pressing down on him. The team set up their equipment in the grand ballroom, transforming it into their base of operations. Cameras were placed in key areas: the seance room, the attic, and the infamous Hall of Fires. Chloe walked slowly through the house, her eyes half closed as she tried to sense the energy of the place. "They're watching us," she said quietly. "They've been waiting." The first night was relatively calm, until around 2 a.m. Dan was monitoring the live feed from the attic when the camera began to flicker. Static filled the screen, and for a brief moment, a shadowy figure appeared, standing motionless in the center of the room. "Mark, you need to see this," Dan said, his voice trembling. Mark rushed over, just in time to see the figure vanish. "Did we lose the feed?" "No," Dan replied. "It's still recording, but whatever that was, it's gone now." Mark frowned. "Chloe, you picking up anything?" Chloe closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's something in the attic. It's old, angry, and it doesn't want us here." Determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences, the team decided to focus their investigation on the seance room, a circular chamber in the heart of the house where Sarah Winchester was said to have communicated with the spirits. "This is where she received her instructions," Mark explained, setting up a digital recorder on the table. "If there's any place where we'll get activity, it's here." As the team settled into the room, Chloe lit a candle and placed it in the center of the table. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the walls. "Spirits of the Winchester house," she intoned, her voice steady and clear. "If you are here, show us a sign." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the candle's flame flickered violently. "Did you feel that?" Dan whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. Before anyone could answer, a loud bang echoed through the room. The door, which had been firmly closed, swung open with a deafening crash. "We're not alone," Chloe said, her eyes wide with fear. The next morning, the team discovered something unexpected. While reviewing the footage from the previous night, they noticed a section of the wall in the seance room that didn't quite match the rest. Intrigued, they decided to investigate. After some searching, Mark found a hidden latch. With a creak, a secret door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "What is this place?" Chloe whispered, peering into the abyss. "Only one way to find out," Mark said, switching on his flashlight. The staircase led to a small, windowless room filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a large wooden chest. "Looks like we found Sarah's private storage," Dan said, wiping dust off the lid. Mark opened the chest carefully. Inside were faded photographs, old letters, and a collection of strange, rune-covered objects. These symbols, they're not just decorative. Chloe said, running her fingers over the carvings. "They're protective wards." Sarah was trying to keep something locked away. As she spoke, a low growl echoed through the room. The walls seemed to shudder, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, grabbing Chloe's arm. Now, that night was the worst yet. Doors slammed shut on their own. Footsteps echoed down empty hallways. Whispering voices filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. Around midnight, Dan disappeared. "Dan, where are you?" Mark called, his voice echoing through the empty house. There was no answer. Panic set in as the team searched the mansion, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light through the dark corridors. Finally, they found him in the seance room, standing in the center of the circle with a vacant expression. "Dan, are you okay?" Mark shook him, but Dan didn't respond. Chloe placed a hand on his forehead and gasped. "He's in a trance. Something's taken hold of him." With great effort, they managed to snap Dan out of it. His eyes fluttered open, and he gasped for air. I saw her," he whispered. "Sarah, she was trying to warn us. We're in danger." By the morning of the final day, the team had had enough. They packed their equipment and prepared to leave. But the house had other plans. Doors that had once opened easily were now locked tight. Windows refused to budge. The house seemed to be alive, determined to keep them inside. "We have to find another way out," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Together, they made their way to the attic, hoping to find an old escape hatch they had seen on the blueprints. The air grew colder with each step, and shadows danced along the walls, watching their every move. At last, they found the hatch. Mark forced it open, and one by one, they climbed onto the roof. As they stood on the roof, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, the oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift. "We made it," Chloe whispered, tears streaming down her face. The team never spoke publicly about what happened inside the Winchester house. The footage they captured was too disturbing, too dangerous to release. To this day, Mark refuses to discuss the details of their experience. Chloe left the paranormal field entirely, and Dan moved across the country, hoping to escape the nightmares that still haunt him. But the Winchester house remains, waiting for the next group brave, or foolish, enough to enter its halls. And it never forgets those who dare to challenge it. Years later, Mark received a letter from an unknown sender. It contained only one photograph, a grainy image of the seance room, with a faint figure standing in the circle. Beneath it was a single sentence, "She's still waiting." Mark burned the letter, but the image never left his mind. And sometimes, late at night, he still feels the eyes of the house upon him, waiting for him to return.